Okay, I think we're going to get started because it's about 2:45 and I want to make sure that I have time to cover everything. Welcome. This is one of the last, I think, sessions of the day, and so thank you so much for being here. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, perfect. My name is Amanda Monaco. I work for the Oregon Department of Justice. I am the Trafficking Intervention Coordinator for the state of Oregon. This is a fairly new position. It's been around for about 2 years this March. We're one of the only places in the nation that has something like this. Texas just hired somebody like this position, but that is about it. So in Oregon, we're really on the forefront of what we're doing, how we're addressing this topic, and how we're collaborating around it. So just a little bit to cover what I'm going to be talking about. This is about a 30,000-foot view of what sex trafficking and CSEC is. So we're not going to really go into depth of how to actually work with the population. That's more of a technical assistance that we offer, or how to do operations or stings. This is really going to talk about what the issue is, how they get into it, who facilitates it, and why they stay in it, how they get out, and kind of some of the models that we're doing around the state and what you guys are doing in your communities and what we're seeing that works. I'm pretty interactive, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. We do have to use the microphone because we're recording this. So please ask questions as we go along. I love to answer them, and we're gonna get started. So just to cover the federal definition, in 2000, the Federal Trafficking Victims Protections Act came out and described and defined trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for a commercial sex act. Within that federal definition, they break it into two different subcategories. So one, you're under 18, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, because we identify that 18-year-olds are minors and they can't consent to sex. And then the other one is labor trafficking. And so that's something that's completely different, yet still has the cruxes of the sex trafficking as we're starting to see. We're starting to see a lot more stuff come out of labor trafficking, especially in the rural communities. But I'm not really gonna talk about that because that's a whole different topic and presentation in itself. So that will be something to come. CSEC. CSEC is another term that you might be hearing. You might also hear DMST, which is domestic sex trafficking. CSEC is commercially sexually exploited children. It's a sexual activity involving a child in exchange for something of value. The child is treated as a commercial sexual object to be sold and traded. So sex act, an exchange of goods of something of value, and they're under the age of 18. That could also be somewhere to stay. They exchange sex for a bed, drugs. Sometimes it could be to keep the electricity on in their apartment, or for food. So just something of value that they're exchanging for that sex, and that's what we're talking about. So the commercial sexual exploitation of children is the intersection of domestic violence, systematic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse. Each one of these issues is huge in itself. We have resource centers that deal specifically with sexual assault. We have resource centers who deal specifically with child abuse. So each one of those issues, take it, combine it, and put it in a teenage psyche. And that's the issue that we're dealing with. It just shows that this is a really complex issue. There's not just a simple, oh, we've been trained, or oh, we have a victim, check, this is good, we're fine. This is a really complicated issue, and the trauma that they experience is very complicated. So some statistics. The average age of entry is about 12 to 14 for girls, 11 to 13 for boys. However, we're not coming into contact with them till about 15. So they've been in what we call the life for a couple years before social service providers or law enforcement or POs are starting to identify these victims. So they have a couple years of trauma before we actually identify them. Out of this study, is this the one from PSU? No, this is a polyvictimization study. 90% of the youth out of the study disclosed prior victimization to their exploitation. They experienced significant polyvictimization. This is not just a one-time thing that happened to them. It's not just a one time that they were assaulted. This happens multiple times, especially if you have a girl who's turning tricks probably about 5-10 times a night, and they've already been in this for a couple years before you come into contact with them. There's a lot of trauma that they're going to be experiencing. And then 77% of the victims in this study were diagnosed with PTSD. I feel like that is really low, actually. So this is just a little quiz to see what you guys know. What percentage of teens will be recruited into the life within 48 hours of running away? Does anybody know? So 1 in 3. We know that within 48 hours of a youth running away from home, 1 in 3 will be approached by a pimp or a trafficker. So that's one area that a lot of communities are looking at is their run reports. So if you have a youth who's been running multiple times, it's very likely that they've at least been approached by a pimp or a trafficker if they haven't already been turned out, which turnout means they've turned their first trick and they've been assaulted for that first time. Yeah. Okay, the question was, what's the difference between a pimp or a trafficker? It's the exact same thing. Pimp is kind of what we're seeing more of a street level, but I'm gonna kind of be using those terms interchangeably. Pimp, trafficker, they're the exact same thing. Thank you. How many youth are exploited annually in the US? Does anyone know? So about 300,000. Now this number, this is an issue that is on the kind of black market, I guess you could say. A lot of people are just now starting to identify it, but even more so than identifying it, we're not keeping stats on it. So while a lot of people might think, oh, well, we don't see those kids, and then they go to a training and they say, oh my gosh, we see those kids all the time, we're not keeping stats on it. So this is a population that we don't know a ton about. This is kind of an estimate, and this estimate comes out of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So hopefully now, as awareness is going out and organizations and different departments are starting to identify the victims, they're starting to keep stats. And then what is the shelf life of someone in the sex industry? Does anyone know? So it's 7 years. So there was a study done by Melissa Farley, who does a ton of research around the sex industry and stuff that comes out of and the trauma that happens in that. We know that somebody who is in the sex industry, who is in the porn industry, has about a 7-year shelf life before their body physically starts falling apart. So sometimes that could be just, you know, their body starts falling apart. It could also mean death. So a little bit of background from what I do. Before I was in this position, I was a case manager for about 6 years with a local nonprofit. So I did intensive case management with victims who directly are involved in sex trafficking. I've worked hundreds of cases, worked directly with law enforcement and the FBI, done operations and stings, worked with the DA's office through cases and everything in between. And so really being able to work with this population, it was about 6 years, and I had to go to a funeral at least once a year. Some of them were by pimps, some of them were by Johns, some were by suicide. These kids were in Oak Creek, they were in Coffee Creek, they were everywhere in between. They were in DHS systems, they've gone everywhere. And so a lot of the experience that I have is from working with this population directly. Excuse me. So I think this is really important to say and to shine light on, that trafficking isn't just something that happens over in another third world country. Trafficking includes the sex industry, which includes pornography, which includes stripping, which includes erotic and nude massage, lingerie parlors, private parties, gang-based prostitution, organized crime, which happens here, internet sites, hotels, so out-call versus in-call, whether the girl goes to you or you go to her, walking the track. A track is it could be a block, it could just be a street that's specifically for the purchase of sex. So like in Multnomah County, 82nd is a really well-known track. 122nd is. Pioneer Square is a really known track for boys. And then clubs, definitely underage clubs. And so I think it's really important to talk about that these all touch sex trafficking. I had kids in every single issue of this. I had them working in the strip clubs, I had them working in the sex shops, they were in pornography. And so when people are saying, well, I'm just engaging in this piece, I'm not doing that trafficking stuff, you're still engaging and you're still having a part of what's happening to these kids. So who is facilitating this exploitation? Pimps, as we talked about, and traffickers. And so pimps kind of are broken up into, you have a guerrilla versus a finesse pimp. A guerrilla pimp, think about guerrilla warfare. They're gonna be way more in your face, they're gonna be way more violent, and they're always gonna keep you on your toes. A finesse pimp isn't gonna be as violent, but they're gonna have a right-armed man who is, or woman, which we call the bottom bitch, or they call the bottom bitch. So a finesse still is very dangerous, and they still are gonna be having high levels of violence, but it might not be by their hand. It could be by their partner or somebody who's working with them. The boyfriend, this is gonna be very, very common because they're not gonna call them pimps. In their minds, they think pimps is this caricature. They don't know what that means. This is their boyfriend. So as I talked about domestic violence and the statistics that we know, it takes a victim at least 7 times to leave her abuser in domestic violence. These are teenagers, but they are experiencing domestic violence. And we don't even have that stat yet, but I would say it's pretty close, if not higher than that, for them to try to leave. So when you work with these victims or you see them or you come across them, they're just gonna call them their boyfriend, and that's what they are to them. Street daddy, if you work with a youth and she talks about her daddy, that is not her dad, and that is a huge red flag that she is in the life and she is working. Because that is something, as I worked with youth, if they use that term, they're in way deeper than just somebody who used the term boyfriend. Madams, there are female pimps too, so just to think that there are male pimps is not true. We have not lots of cases, but a handful of cases where girls and females are part of it as well, or running it themselves. And then familial pimping. This is the family business, and you can't just think of a minority gang family. Sometimes it's the middle-class white family that this is what happens to them, and this is what dad does on the side. And so really try to get out of those stereotypes, but this definitely can be the family business. It can also be a family business where dad is a kingpin. And so I'm gonna teach you how to do this so you don't have to work for a pimp, but yet all of your money's gonna come back to me. So if that's the family and the community that you grow up in, how are you gonna get out of that? Organized crimes and gangs. I worked with kids from, Mexican mafia, Russian, street gangs, absolutely. So organized crimes, absolutely, is part of it. This is now the second most money-making operation under guns. It surpassed drugs. Does anybody know why? Low risk. You sell a baggie of drugs one time, and then it's done, and you have to get more. You can sell a girl over and over and over again. It's a huge, huge moneymaker. Johns, which we call another name for the buyers, they absolutely help facilitate this exploitation. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. This is a business. It's supply and demand. If there's no demand, you don't need a supply. And so absolutely the people that purchase these kids and women are part of the problem. Systematic oppression, and then communities who fail to protect their children and other vulnerable populations, who fail to open their eyes that this happens. I would get a lot of people, once they found out what I did, would say, oh, well, Portland, that's #1 in the nation, that's a huge hub. And what I would tell them was, not necessarily, it's just this is an issue that we have shined the light on. And so because we're opening our eyes and shining the light on it, it seems like it's a big issue, but it's not that bigger than Dallas or Denver or any other big city, or even little cities. Those can be some of the most busiest hubs. So it's a business. This study took into account what pimps could make per week. In Atlanta, they made $32,000. In Dallas, it was $12,000. And this was in between 2005 and 2011, so this is a little dated. Seattle, it was $18,000. They are motivated by money. They make a ton of money. They don't pay taxes on this. This is their income base. And it is all about money. I don't care what anybody says, this is a business to them. This is all about money. And when you take those girls away from them, you're taking their income away. This is a little bit of a dated map, but it kind of shows you the circuits. There's a Western circuit and an Eastern circuit. I know the Dakotas are really popular and popping right now. Does anybody know why? Can you think of oil? Yeah, absolutely, oil. And what else do you have in the Dakotas? What kind of populations? Natives. So you have a very vulnerable population up there and a lot of money coming into that. Absolutely. I know Alaska is really hot right now, and it's really interesting. There's also another circuit popping up between LA and Guam. So that one was interesting. So there's about 3 stages that they take them through once they meet a young lady. And I am really going to be talking about female victims. This happens to males. I've worked with them. The dynamics is much different, and that takes, again, another presentation. It's more specific. But I do want to say this does happen to males and not forget that. But what I'm talking about is normally what a female experience is going to be like when they're starting to get into the life. And so you have a girl, and she's at the mall, or she's hanging out with her friends, or she's even at school. It could be at church. It could really be anywhere. And she's approached by a person. He could be old, he could be young. We've seen pimps as young as 17, and the gangs are starting to reel them in a lot younger. We've seen them as old as, oh, God knows how old. And so it really doesn't matter, but they know exactly who to target. They are skilled at this. They know exactly who to target, and they know who is vulnerable. I watched a interview of a pimp, and he was talking about how when he would approach a girl, if she looked him and answered him and he looked him in the eye, he knew he could just keep moving because she had enough wherewithal to address him and look him in the eye. If she looked at the ground when she answered him, he knew she was totally primed for the picking because of her self-esteem and how she held herself. So they know exactly who to target. And so they are so smooth. They're so smooth. There was one pimp that we prosecuted that got life without parole for the first time in Oregon history, and he had a psych eval, and the person who evaluated said he is on the 100th percentile. Like, he has interviewed serial killers, serial rapists, and this is the worst of the worst that he has ever seen, and it was a pimp that was on the streets working a ton of our girls. You can actually look it up. He tried to sue Nike because, yeah, Sir Giorgio, yep. So they know exactly who to target and what to say. They come alongside and say, well, nobody understands you. I get you. You're beautiful. And what 13, 12-year-old girl doesn't want to hear that? You know, I get you. I understand you. And they start a relationship in what this young girl's mind is. And it is relationships. They fall in love with them. They know exactly what to say. And so all of a sudden, they're in love with this person. They're going to build a house with them. They're going to have a life with them. And this might be somebody who's been in the system, who has this dream of what they want but have never been able to get that. You know, there was another study that said we know that not every youth who is sexually assaulted or sexually abused is exploited, but about 90% of the youth who are exploited were sexually abused as a child. So they've already experienced trauma, and now this person knows exactly what to target. And this can happen in a couple hours. This can happen over a week. I've even heard of pimps going to mom and dad's house for dinner and like mowing the lawn. They know what they need to do to get their product. And then the breaking stage happens. And the breaking stage is violent, and it can happen over, like I said, an hour. It can happen longer than that. It could happen just like domestic violence. Yes, it could happen with them being tied up and put in a hotel room, like taken. Yes, but that is not the majority of what happens. That is the minority of those cases. What really happens is now they're in this relationship, and he comes to her and says, baby, I owe this guy some money, but if you just have sex with him, then I don't have to pay him. And I'll still love you, and you can fuck for free, but you can't fuck for money. So you just need to do this. And just do it this one time, and I'll totally get it, and I love you, and we'll be fine. So she now is doing something that she never thought that she would ever do, and she does it that one time. And then he comes to her again, and it happens again. And before she knows it, she's on the street turning tricks, and that's her life. And she has no way out because there's no way she can tell anybody what is happening to her and what she's done because she chose it, right? She made that choice. Did she really? And then maintenance is so easy. It's buying a hamburger every now and then. It's buying them clothes. But the clothes are clothes that they're going to work in. So it's not actually buying them clothes. It's clothes that they're going to be working that night in. And then you got them. So why do they stay? A lot of people ask, why do they stay? Why do they stay? If there's a cop down the street or somebody that, their teacher or somebody that they can reach out to, why don't they just reach out to them? Why don't they call them? Why do they stay? Trauma bonding, Stockholm syndrome, this is absolutely what they're experiencing. And this is really intense stuff to try to break because they love them and they're going to fix them. And if you say anything bad about them, you're the bad person because you don't know him like I know him. He's going to be a great dad. He's going to be a great guy. We just got to get over this. Does it sound like domestic violence? I mean, and this is a 13-year-old who's talking about a 30-year-old, 20-year-old, whoever, who knows. Fear and intimidation, absolutely. And it's the fear of, well, if you leave, I'm going to go get your little sister and I'm going to make her do this. Or I'm going to go kill your family. And he's going to show you pictures that he took of the family. Whether or not his reach is that far, that's that feeling that no matter what, he's going to do this. And I would rather have this happen to me than for it to happen to anybody in my family that I love. So I'm just going to be the strong one and I'm going to deal with it and I'm going to be stuck in this so that nobody else gets hurt. A lot of times when I worked with victims that were getting ready for testimony for the cases, a lot of them were still struggling with their feelings with their pimp. They still loved him, they still missed him, even though they knew that he was bad for them. And I remember sitting down and talking to one of my girls, and she was like, I'm struggling with this, but I know that I don't want what he did to me to happen to anybody else, but I still don't want him to get in trouble. And she was still struggling with that, but she knew that she didn't want anybody else to have to go through what she went through, and that's why she testified. Family, this is the family business like I talked about. I remember I worked with one girl, and she went into treatment, and then she came out, and I distinctively remember this day. We were sitting in an ice cream shop with her sitting across from me. She was 16 years old, and she was eating an ice cream cone. And she said, Amanda, I just can't do it anymore. It is too hard. Everywhere I go, everybody knows what I've done and what's happened to me. All of my friends are saying, I love you, come work for my boyfriend. He'll take care of you. I love you, you should come work for my boyfriend. You can make a lot of money and he'll totally take care of you. She's like, I was walking my niece in the park and there were guys soliciting me all the time. And I think it was partly where she lived. But this was her life. This was her community. So I don't know a lot of adults who would be able to walk away from their family or their community, and you're asking a teenager to do that, this is a really hard, complicated choice that they have to make, especially when that's all they know. And addiction and normalcy. Addiction is part of the life, but what we see is that the ones who are really, truly addicted to alcohol and drugs are the older ones who've been in it for a really long time. If you're working with the young ones, it's a total different addiction. The life itself is addictive. And this is kind of how I explain it. You go through life and it's just status quo. Then something traumatic happens and it spikes up, whether it's a car accident, a medical event, or something, and you're up here in this trauma kind of section. You deal with it and you kind of go back to status quo. Their life is turned upside down. They live up here. This is the norm for them. They live on eggshells. They have all that adrenaline all the time. So that becomes very addictive. So then you pull somebody out of that. You put them into a foster home, and actually a really great foster home with foster parents who get the issue, get the polyvictimization and the trauma and all that type of stuff. And then they run. Because I can absolutely 100% guarantee you they will run. I don't know how many kids I met with after they ran, they would call me because I was a non-mandated reporter. Excuse me. And we would meet and they would say, I didn't really want to run. I just didn't know what to do. I felt like I was coming out of my skin. I didn't know what to do. And I was so bored. You expect me to stay home at night and just do what? I'm like, watch TV, be bored. They have to learn for the first time or relearn how to live this whole different lifestyle because they've lived up here in a constant. And so it's almost coming down off of that and learning how to live at a lower level. So a lot of people ask, like, why is this an issue? Why is this an issue? Our media, definitely, the sexualization of youth. I mean, these girls, some of them look like they might be 5 or 6. And so we skew the age of consent because these ads are telling you this person is sexually available for you. And so we tell our girls their worth is based on their looks, the male entitlement. This is just, boys are gonna be boys, you're 18, we're gonna go get you a hooker. This is what we do. Or we're gonna go to the strip club. That's just what we're doing. It's innocent, fun, harmless. Almost every single one of the kids that I worked with, and I worked hundreds of cases, at one point or another had worked in the back rooms of strip clubs or in the hotel room next door. So just saying, hey, I'm gonna go to a strip club and just be fine and fun and it's just totally fun. You don't know where the minors are because they're there, I can guarantee you. And they might not be there that night, but they're there the next night and they were there the night before. And so this is the message that we're telling our society. And we know from history that once you dehumanize a population and now it's an object, it's so much easier to create violence against an object versus a person. And so now these girls are objects. They're an object that you rented for a half an hour and you paid money for it so you can do whatever you want. And that's the view that people have. I used to teach at John's school, so when law enforcement do stings, there's a couple different types. They either go after the pimps and exploiters, the girls, trying to identify them and pick them up and offer them resources, or they go after the Johns. And so if they're picked up for soliciting sex, they get a $1,000 fine and they have to go to John's school. It's an 8-hour, one-day John's school. In King County they do, I think it's a week-long one, but the one here is only 8 hours. And so it's really interesting to talk to these guys of like, okay, so we know why you're here. It's very obvious what you did. And one of the questions I would ask them is, what are the assumptions you made of this person that you attempted to purchase? And they were so genuine when they would say, well, I thought she liked me. She was picky, like she picked me. Like it was 2 consenting adults. Are you sure she was 18? Because if she wasn't 18, you just raped a child. That's the reality according to the law. And they just had no idea because nobody had actually broken it down. This is what they thought that they were able to do, and this is totally fine. Everybody does this, right? She wanted it, I wanted it, we're great. But nobody actually talks about the realities of what happens with the life and what happens. And no, she didn't really just want it. You were just a date. So who's at risk? Under 18, own or have access to a computer. They want consumer goods. They want the newest Jordans or Juicy Bag or whatever, kids want these days. They want to feel more grown up. They want to be in a romantic relationship. They might feel misunderstood. They want to feel more independent. I mean, who does this sound like? It can be anybody. You're right. Yes. It can be anybody. It can be the little white girl from across the street in the most prominent areas of town. It can be the minority who's living in not the prominent area of town and doesn't have parents. It can be somebody who is in school. I had a lot of girls that actually would go to school and then work at night. They would be turning tricks at night and then try to go to school during the day. I even had one who had a part-time job at McDonald's, still working at McDonald's and going to school trying to figure out how to get out of this. But we know that the greater oppression creates vulnerabilities. So if they have a history of sexual abuse, if they're a minority, if they have a lower economic status, if they're part of the system, whether that's DHS or the Juvenile Justice Department, if their parents are part of that system, or they have family members who've been in the life, I think that's it. We know that these are the populations that are at the highest risk for this to happen to them. It can happen to anybody, yes, but these are the populations that are really being targeted. These are the populations that we're really seeing being victimized with this issue. This study came out and it was really interesting because it actually calls out Oregon. And it's from the sex abuse to prison to pipeline. It's actually a really, really great study. I would highly recommend anybody looking at it. But it talks about girls in the juvenile justice system. And in Oregon, I can't see that, 93% of the girls in Oregon juvenile justice system were sexually and physically abused. 76% were sexually abused, and 63% were both. And so if we're talking about vulnerable populations, here you go. Here they are, if you're looking for where they are. This is per, I think it's 100,000 in the system. 123 were African American, 179 were Native American. If you're looking for where this happens and where to find it and where the victims are, these are where they're hiding. This is where you have to start looking to start identifying these victims so that we can get a true grasp of those numbers so we can start offering services to them and stop this cycle. This is really helpful when you're working with kids, and we use this all the time, talking about them coming out of the life and using this cycle of change. A lot of people use it for, like, if you're trying to quit smoking or you want to start joining a gym. And so sometimes you go through life and you don't even know you really need to join a gym, or you're perfectly happy smoking and not running, and you're totally fine with that. And then you move to the place where you think, oh, well, maybe I should probably join a gym. I probably want to tone up, and I guess I can go look, and maybe I'll go look, maybe I'll go talk to one. And then you move to the next stage and you actually go to a gym and you sign up. And then you're doing great and you're working out and you're just going every day and you're feeling great. And then you go on vacation and you don't go every day and you eat more than you're supposed to. And then you relapse, and then you have to start all over again. And so when you're working with these kids, it's really, really easy to see where they are in this cycle if they even identify that they're a victim. Because these kids aren't going to identify that they're a victim. They don't see themselves as victims, and so it's really hard to identify them when you don't have a victim coming up to you being like, I'm a victim, please help me. Because they're not going to want that. They're going to be the most difficult kids that you've ever worked with, but they're also going to stick with you. And they are going to be the ones that are the hardest and the ones that struggle the most, but they're going to be the ones that are going to stay with you and you're going to remember. So what is being done? What we are doing in Oregon, we are working on building task forces around the state. And these task forces identify that not one organization can meet the needs of this population. The needs of this population are so vast and so great that not one organization can do it. If you come in with that stance of, I'm going to rescue them, that's not going to be helpful, because they're the ones that actually have to do the work. You have to be the ones that come alongside and encourage and support them. So we know that it takes collaboration, and it needs to be multidisciplinary. There needs to be law enforcement, there needs to be DHS, there needs to be juvenile justice department, there needs to be mental health, there needs to be the feds, because a lot of these cases go federal if they're not going to go state, and there needs to be an advocate. And this needs to be wrapped around the victim, because you need to wrap services around them, because they're going to need to have somebody to call at 2 a.m. when they're being triggered and when they don't know what to do and they're going to run. They need to have somebody to talk to and talk through that. And so this is where we build these task forces, and we have 7 of them right now in the state. These are the counties that have them. They're all in different stages of development, and some of them have different people at the table depending on their county. And so what I'm doing is I'm going into these communities, building these task forces, so one, they can start identifying where these kids are coming from and where we can start identifying them. So who needs to be trained? Then how do we start screening for them? DHS now, because of federal mandate, they have to start screening and start identifying trafficking victims, so we're going to get a lot of data from them. But now that they're starting to identify them, what are we going to do with them? If you have law enforcement that you're training and they pick up a girl in the middle of the night, what are you going to do with them? Where are you going to take them? If there's no shelter, are you going to take them to detention? If that's the only option, then you got to do what you got to do, because they're going to leave. But if that's the only option, that's not good enough, because then you're proving the message that their pimp is telling them, because their pimp is telling them, you're the one doing the crime. You're the one that's actually doing it, so you're going to be the one that's in trouble. I'm not going to be in trouble. So how do we make sure that we don't make good on the pimp's promises? So on top of building these task forces, I am also putting together our Attorney General's Trafficking Advisory Committee. And so this is coming out of the AG's office, and this is heads of OHA, this is heads of DHS, we have somebody from OIA, we have a couple DAs, we have tribal representation, we have Survivor, my co-chair is a survivor who is now building another organization helping other survivors, so we have Survivor Voice. We have advocates, we have Homeless Youth Continuum, I already said DHS, and we're not full yet. I'm trying to make sure that we have representation from across the state so that I have people from Malheur County, because it's going to look different in Malheur County than it looks in Deschutes County, and it's going to look different in Douglas County than it looks in Curry County. And so I really want to make sure that we have enough representation from across the state so that we can make informed decisions. And so this advisory committee is coming out with policies and procedures for the state, also coming out with some protection for our task forces so that when people come to them and say, well, we don't think that you're doing a good job and we want to do our own thing, who are you? They can now say, well, we're supported by the Attorney General. There's a lot of good people out there who want to do good, but sometimes do harm in wanting to do that because they have just enough information to be dangerous. And so with this setup that we're putting in across the state is hoping to kind of mitigate that. And so that there's a very clear path of who to go to and who to reach out to when you want to work with this population, or if you want to get something going, or you need support and you need training. So these are kind of the three purposes that I have of this. My biggest thing is that we've got to get these victims to start being identified. If we don't identify them, then they're being re-victimized and nobody's coming in and saying, I see you. How do we help you? How do we get you out of this? Because we're not stopping the issue. It's kind of all these different things and all these factors that have to happen at the same time. But if we don't even know what to look for, how are we going to start identifying them? And if we don't identify them, how are we going to find those gaps in services and in the system that we have to fill? Because we don't know how to fill, because we don't know what they're needing. And also to build a crisis and long-term response. So not only do they need to have a response for, we found you right now, we need to get you somewhere safe, we need to get you food, we need to let you be able to sleep because you might have not been able to sleep for a couple of days. And then we need to get you services long-term because you're going to need them long-term. And so this is what we're building across the state of identifying what that looks like. We have one shelter for the state that's CSEC specific, and it's only for female and female identified up to 16. So there's huge gaps that we need to fill. And so this is kind of a case study to show why this works and how this works. And this is off of what Multnomah County did when I was a case manager. I was a non-mandated reporter, but in that, everybody else was, and I collaborated amazingly. And they knew that I was there for the victim. I wasn't there to keep secrets. I was there for their safety, and they knew that I was there for them. Somebody was in the room that was your person, that was you were their main concern, and they had no agenda. So the policy is that once a victim was identified, an advocate was called out automatically. We didn't ask if they wanted one, because a lot of times they don't know what an advocate is, or they don't want to imposition you. They're like, no, it's late, that's fine, it's okay. So instead of asking them, we just automatically, advocate called out. And we had great law enforcement who worked with us. So whether the girl was picked up by law enforcement or they came into a shelter, advocate instantly called out. And we meet with them. And so when we met with them, it was the first time that somebody might come alongside them with no strings attached and say, how are you right now? Are you okay? Do you need to go to the hospital? What's been going on? Are you hurt? Are you hungry? When's the last time you ate? talk about collaborative and needing a lot of people. We had a lot of other faith-based organizations and community organizations who really wanted to support this. So they donated $5 gift cards to us and to law enforcement so that we could buy food for the victims. So that law enforcement didn't have to go through the whole issue of getting reimbursed, and we didn't have to either. Because there was at one point, it was ridiculous how much you have to spend to sometimes support these victims. So we had those $5 gift cards, so we could just give them the basic needs. If you haven't eaten in 2 days, you're not going to want to answer any questions because your stomach is eating itself. So it's like, okay, well, let me grab you some food, even if that's just a granola bar and a bottle of water right now. You're okay physically. You don't need to go to the doctor, okay? When's the last time you got tested? Do you need to be tested? Because we know what's been going on out there. And just kind of being there for them. And because I built that relationship with them, and that could happen, in an hour, it could happen in a couple hours, I could then start vouching for law enforcement. Yeah, they're cops, they are, but they get it, and they're here for you, and they want to help you. So if you trust me, I trust them, and you should trust them. And sometimes that could happen in that night. Sometimes it's a year later that one of my girls would open up to me and say, okay, I think I'm ready to report. I think I'm ready to talk to law enforcement because I trust you and you say I can trust them, so build that bridge. So then that would lead to a disclosure, and then grand jury. Grand jury could have happened, one time it happened the very next morning, and so we had to keep them safe that night. Other times it's the week later or whatever. And so they go to grand jury. And that's where a legal advocate is important because I'm a community-based advocate. I'm not an expert on the law, so I need the DA's advocate to come alongside and help me and support this and be in their role. But I'm going to be there when she needs somebody the next night because she's triggered from grand jury. She's not going to call the DA's advocate, she's going to call me. So then, goes to grand jury, and trial is going to happen. But who knows when trial is going to happen? You know how it is. So what's going to happen between grand jury and trial? Who knows? Life is going to happen. They're going to need basic needs. They're going to need support. They're going to need housing. They're going to need schooling. They're going to need everything. And so you need somebody in the community that's going to make sure that that's all connected, that those resources are brought to them. And then you're also going to need somebody there through trial, because trial can be so triggering and can be so hard. Because especially if they testify, they have to face their abuser. And their abuser, there was one case that I was in, he would randomly start singing songs, like little blurps. And nobody would understand, they just thought he was crazy. But those songs and those blurps had very significant meaning for that victim. And he was sending her messages while she was trying to testify or while she was in that courtroom. Nobody else knew that besides her and me as the advocate. But this was a really, really hard time. And even in the middle of that, she was able to graduate, which was amazing and fantastic because this case, sometimes they are zoos. It is a jungle, like it is just a circus in there. And so to be able to have support wrapped around them, to be able to get them food during lunch, to be able to make sure that they even get to court, whether that's a cab or going to pick them up, there's a lot of wraparound support that needs to happen. And then trial ends, and then what? There's still a lot of healing that needs to happen. And during this time, there's probably going to be relapses. They're probably going to go back to the life, because if life happens and a bill comes up, or it's a birthday for their son, and they don't have the money, they know forever that they can go down to that corner, turn that trick, and make that money. Just for that moment, because if I just do it one more time, it's not bad because I've done it before. And so this is something that they're going to have to struggle and face every single day of the rest of their life. And so it's really important to make sure that those services continue after trial and help with healthy relationships, help with money management, because they don't keep any of their money. He might give them a $5 bill to go get a hamburger, but you better bring the change and the receipt back to me, because they don't keep any of it. And so they're surrounded by money, but they never actually handle the money. And so their relationship with money has a whole nother connotation that needs to be dealt with. You know, the other thing of, do they want to become speakers in this movement? Do they want to heal and come back? Teaching them how to have public speaking skills. You don't have to answer all the questions that people ask you, because they're going to ask you inappropriate questions. and you don't have to answer that, and letting them know that so that every time they speak, they don't get re-triggered and go back into this life. There's so many support that needs even after trial. And this is just one trial. I've had a lot of kids who had multiple cases in multiple states. I had one that had a case happening in Atlanta, in LA, in Alaska, and then in Oregon, pretty much all around the same time. So this can be multiple times that this happens. So this is kind of what our office also offers. Training and awareness, we do a lot of these. I partner a lot of the time with FBI victim specialists. We're actually training Indian child welfare in Pendleton tomorrow. And EMS providers up there. We offer technical assistance, so more in-depth training of how to actually work with this population. Also, we partner with local law enforcement and offer technical assistance for them, how to work operations, doing decoy schools, and how to do all the ins and outs of that. We have development of task forces and toolkits, with grant proposals and resources, so whatever is needed. I am really here as a resource. I'm here wanting to know what communities are needing, what's going to help, how can I help, whatever that is. This is something that I'm super passionate about and I love doing, and so I'm really, really here as a resource, and I'd love to hear any thoughts or any needs that are out there. And my contact information is here. I have flyers and brochures up here also that we put together. And then we have a little bit for questions if anybody has any. I think we have to use the microphone.
So are you reaching out and tapping into the resources that the sex industry itself has developed to help identify? I'm thinking Cupcake Girls, I'm thinking, Children of the Night, the internal agencies that, the industry itself have developed should have enormous information.
Yes and no. Yes, and I have a great relationship with the Cupcake Girls. They're fantastic. So we do reach out to them, yes. There's other organizations. Children of the Night is funded by Hugh Hefner also, so there's some stuff going on there. But I do absolutely reach out for the resources that are already available and figure out how we can kind of build this, whether that's industry stuff, whether that's sexual assault centers, whether that's child abuse centers, and how do we already encompass the resources that are already there. And I reach out to a ton of different organizations that are working with this population, because I never want to get to the point where I think I know that I'm doing a really good job, but I actually have no idea what they really need. So yes, I do reach out and work with them a lot. Any other questions?
So it sounds like most of your contact happens after law enforcement gets involved?
Yes and no. Right now it's easiest for people to identify victims through law enforcement, but I'm also, as we're putting together flow charts, we're trying to figure out how, because when I worked with cases, they didn't all work with law enforcement. There was actually a huge case of them that never touched law enforcement. So I'm hoping that through DHS, as they're identifying, we're trying to figure out a flow chart for service providers and victims who never touch law enforcement. But right now, law enforcement is kind of the easiest way to identify them. But we're trying to also work with other ones because they don't all have to touch law enforcement.
Right, and so it sounds like that's what you're trying to do, is to get to them before.
Yes. I would love to be able to identify them before they actually get picked up in a sting.
So you mentioned that most of these girls, if they're runaway, will get approached within 48 hours, 1 in 3. And I've been working in our community on the 13th Night Initiative. How important is it to try and get these kids off the street early and do things like the 13th night as far as prevention goes? Is that a great prevention strategy?
I mean, yes, prevention is so important. Right now, I feel like we're just trying to put out fires. So prevention is so important, and that is a statistic that is held true. So the 13th night and those initiatives are so vastly important because you're keeping a child from potentially very, very traumatic and extreme trauma and victimization. And so if any child that you can keep from having that happen to them or being victim to that, I would highly support and say, yes, I would support those prevention issues as well. We don't have a ton of prevention happening, but there is some. And so, like I said, right now we're putting out fires, and I would love for there not to be so many fires. So prevention, yes, I would highly support those initiatives. Any other? I don't know what time it is. A couple more minutes. If there's any other questions, I'm up here. We can get out a little early. Like I said, I have flyers up here just for a basic overview, and I can absolutely order more if you're an officer, you want them. And I'm here for questions. Thank you so much.